So, interesting quote. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Yeah, well, that was a quote by a fellow named William Gibson, a writer, sci-fi writer from the early 90s. And that was a quote that served me well in the last 20 plus years of trying to push forward change at a company like Panera and in the food businesses in general. And I can tell you, the future actually is here today, but it isn't evenly distributed. And ultimately, the restaurant business is starting to figure that out. But let's take a little bit of a look at what's going on around the food business, and particularly the restaurant industry, and how that's moving forward, and some of the challenges there. And when you think about it, the restaurant industry is always focused on the customer, more than anyone realizes. And I can tell you today, as you sit, and having done this for 20-so years, when you sit in the boardrooms of major restaurant companies, what we're talking about is how do you be competitive? How do you stay relevant for your target customer, for the audiences in general? And I can tell you around the country today, in every major boardroom, in every major restaurant chain, they're being presented with big, thick decks explaining how the world is changing around them. And it's terrifying. I can tell you, I've heard it, I've seen it. I've been a little terrified, I get it. And what's happening is health is showing up in a way that we've never seen before in the restaurant industry by our consumers. And what's driving that? What's driving that are the millennials. Millennials today are becoming a serious, serious force inside the restaurant industry. When you think about restaurants, and when I was a kid, we went to a restaurant, it seemed like maybe once or twice a year. I think I do that every day now. And I think most of us have seen a dramatic rise in how often we frequent restaurants and quick service restaurants, fast food places, drive-thrus, coffee shops. They're everywhere. And just to give you a sense of it, when I started in the industry, it was a $15 billion a year industry. Today, it's almost $700 billion a year industry. And that's in just about 30 years. So it's a huge industry. It's got a lot of power. And it's facing a huge, huge challenge from this group called the millennials, who are becoming the workforce today. And they have a different opinion about food, and they think of it differently than folks like myself or baby boomers have thought about it over the years. And one of the key things is when they think about good-for-me food, they don't think necessarily how many calories or how much fat or that sort of stuff is important, but the reality is things like where did it come from? What's the story behind the food? How sustainable is it? What's its impact on the planet? Those are becoming key issues around the restaurant industry, and it's being driven by consumers who are demanding it. And what you see out there today are restaurants trying to understand how to make that work in that world. And the reality is, when you think about it, they're not just looking for a better sort of food quality. They're looking to make a difference, because that's what they believe in. We all believe in making a difference at some level, but the millennial generation is pushing hard and forcing companies into that world. And you know, it's funny, when you think about getting it right, what that means is, do I have sustainable food that comes from somewhere I know? What degree is local on the agenda where I go to eat? That really starts to matter today. You know, and beyond even the food, the worker conditions, the pay, those are things that have been very big topics lately in the news. Those are continuing to service to the forefront. And ultimately, the restaurant industry's got a lot of challenges on figuring out how to really dial in to where their consumer is demanding that they go. And when you think about the future's already here, I look around, DC is a great place. Sweet Green is doing it right. You can see them today. They're doing it fresh. They're doing it right with their people. You know, there are models out there, right? You know, there are, out in the West Coast, places like Mendocino Farms and Tender Green. There are small models that are going to be the next wave of growth in our industry. They're all small today, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 stores. But over the next decade, this will be the next wave, these next generation restaurants. And you can see that future happening. But there's a reality to that that's a little different as well. And that is, it's the distributed part, right? While that may be the future, how it's distributed has really got to change. And I think ultimately, when you think about it, it's access. You know, if I'm here today and I want to go get a great salad, I can go to Sweet Green and I can get it fresh. I know where it's coming from. It's sustainable. But I tell you, I drove here from Syracuse yesterday, and between here and there, you know, it may not be a food desert, but I don't know what, you don't really kind of know what you're eating in most of the places in the country. It's very hard to find high quality, transparent, sustainable food that the average person can access at a price point that they can get to. And I think ultimately the idea of distributing a better food system is really where a lot of the action starts to show up for us. And you think about it, companies like Panera and Chipotle, who I think have been trying to take as much of a lead as we can in the industry and push further, we're trying to move beyond sort of the old way things have always been done in this business. And the reality is, a lot of restaurant chains are facing some very tough choices. You know, they're going to have to decide somewhere between profitability, sustainability, consumer outreach, and ultimately the ability to be relevant with an audience is changing, and it's changing quickly. So the challenge really out there today is, how do we make that happen? And what's been interesting and rewarding for me at Panera is we've been able to sort of take the idea of getting larger and scaling up and using that for good. So our ideas have been, how do you take things like, and create things like the antibiotic-free chicken industry for the restaurant business? That didn't exist until we found out the customers were looking for that. We could find the product, we could do it right, we could get it in front of a customer, and they'd respond, and it would drive top line, which then drove bottom line. That model started to drive an industry. Chipotle, in the same sort of vein, you see the success that they've had over the last 20 years, driven by the fact that people want to know where their food's coming from, and they want to make a difference in how they're eating. And I think companies like Chipotle and Panera and the others out there today that are pushing harder on their systems are helping drive a wedge and try to help change really how people interact with food today. And I'm talking about the daily stuff. You know, it's the everyday, what you're eating, that really matters. So ultimately, the big challenge here for us is, how do we continue to help drive that? Because really, these smaller chains, as they grow, they're going to need support from a larger supply system as well. So we're out there pushing, and I think, again, more companies are trying to figure out, how do you make this big difference in the world through your suppliers, but by using your customers? And I'd say that's the next thing that's very important on the agenda. You're going to hear a lot more about it in the next coming years, is as restaurant companies pushing back on their suppliers to find out how they can be more sustainable. I know that as we've been working through this whole removing the artificial colors and flavors and preservatives from our menu, it's creating a lot of angst for our suppliers. They're having to figure out new ways to do things. But they know if they want to stay with us, they're going to have to solve this. So we're actually able to use the consumer voice to help push forward a real change in the industry. And we're starting to see it happen. And I know that Chipotle is pushing on those same sorts of things. I think the more that large restaurant chains can embrace this, make the tough decisions, push their vendors, they're going to have the ability to be relevant for their customers in the future. And I tell you, in today's world, I know there's a lot of talk about the customer can't drive it sometimes. In the restaurant business, the customer completely drives it. And today, more so than ever. Think about the socially transparent world we live in today. You can't do anything without everybody knowing about it and talking about it. On top of that, think about the world of big data and all the information that we have at our access now through loyalty programs and electronic payment process. We now know better than ever what motivates customers, and the industry is responding. And the biggest thing I can tell you is consumers continue to make sure that you're driving and sharing the kind of values that you have with the places that you're doing business, with those kind of restaurant chains, because ultimately the customer is in the driver's seat more than ever as it comes to driving sustainability through the food system. Restaurant companies will respond, and those that don't won't end up surviving. And those that do will be able to take that distribution and make a huge opportunity out of it, and that's really will be the winners in the next generation of restaurant concepts. Thank you.